My name is Evelyn Marie Carter. I'm 34 years old and I live in Rochester, New York. A two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on a street that smells like hot metal and stale coffee in the winter. For the last 5 years I've been a night shift medical transcriptionist, which means most of my life is spent listening to other people's emergencies and typing them into calm sentences so insurance will pay. My days are a jumble of cold coffee, fluorescent lights, and late-night walks that try to pretend everything is normal. Emotionally, I'm raw and practical. I've learned to measure grief in lists and deadlines. The funeral lasted 3 hours, the cemetery 30 minutes, and the town held its breath long enough to gossip later in the diner. I am still learning how to sit with the quiet after those breaths. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The Carter house, the one with the peeling white paint and the porch swing that squeaked like an old hinge, felt like a museum of small betrayals. It smelled of lemon oil and old smoke, of cardboard boxes and the lavender sachets my grandfather kept in the dresser drawers. The funeral home had done their best. The room was arranged just how Grandpa liked it. His army jacket folded on a chair, the stained baseball cap on display, a cello recording wisping through a cheap speaker. I remember thinking in that moment that funerals are less about the dead and more about the living deciding who gets what remains. The tense humidity of human judgment lingered. I wasn't supposed to come, not really. There'd been years of distances knitted from pride, arguments, and silence. My mother left when I was 9, not in a dramatic Hollywood way, but in small, terrible ways. She packed one suitcase, scribbled a note, and never came back. My grandparents raised me after that, and for a while the house was a safe harbor. Grandpa was steady, a man who hummed under his breath when he read the newspaper. My Aunt Marian, blonde hair always pinned tight, perfume like crushed oranges, watched everything with a kind of polished attentiveness that felt less like care and more like inventory. We were not a happy family. People who live in small Midwestern towns learn to file their pain away neatly, tuck it behind postcards, put it in jars, label it and stack it on the back shelf. But the jars crack. You can tell when they will. The last time I saw Aunt Marian before the funeral had been 2 years ago, at a town meeting about zoning. She'd smiled at me like a judge smiles before delivering a verdict. There had been a whispered meeting she arranged 2 floors below the public hall, and afterward neighbors clucked their tongues as though I had done something indecent. That image returned to me repeatedly on the drive into town. Marian's neat hands folding and unfolding a paper napkin, her eyes assessing what could be controlled. The room at the attorney's office smelled of expensive coffee and leather. There were folding chairs, a thin bowl of wrapped mints, and the kind of fluorescent light that makes everyone look tired and honest. Family trickled in, neighbors, the preacher, distant cousins I could never place. My knees made small, surprised creaking sounds as I sat. There were photos of Grandpa all around. Him at 70 with a sunburned nose, him with my mother when she was small and had giant bow ribbons in her hair. I felt like an outsider in my own ancestry. When the attorney, a precise woman named Claire, cleared her throat and began the formalities, my throat felt tight like a fist. She read the will in a voice practiced to be even, but words do not carry tone as well as a room of people can cook it. When she reached the part where my name should have been listed as an heir, my stomach gave way. There was a paragraph, and it was specific. The house and its contents shall be distributed among those named. Any family member found to have severed ties intentionally shall forfeit any claim. That sentence hit like a gate slamming. My aunt looked at me then, and I remember every detail. The ridge of blue at her wrist from a cold vein, the precise smoothing of her skirt, the way she set her jaw like a machine. She said, loud enough for everyone, "You're not family anymore." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. It landed in me differently than anything else that day. Not like grief, but like dismissal, the kind that shreds before you can even defend the threads. A dozen family members glanced away, because people always look away when a household betrays a household. "You're not family anymore," she repeated, folding her hands as if saying it was a relief. I remember the air in the hearing room tightening around that phrase. My ears filled with blood. I could feel my hands shake. My mind tried to arrange the moment into something sensible. What was the legal basis, if any, for choosing family like this? Who gets to decide who is family? Those are the kinds of questions you ask when someone else picks you up like a misfiled document and drops you in the reject bin. I could have walked out then. Maybe I should have. There was a bar of sunlight through the blinds that cut the floor like a promise of escape. Instead I stayed. I wanted to see it through. Partly because of stubbornness, partly because grief makes you greedy for last things, last looks, last justifications. The lawyer tapped a stack of papers and then, as if on cue, said, "There is one sealed letter Mr. Carter requested be opened only in the presence of all named parties." All at once the room tasted metallic. My pulse clicked against my teeth like a clock. I had lived so many years carrying an absent mother like a hollow instrument. I had rehearsed and rephrased how to be abandoned until I could do it with polite grammar. This felt different. There was a chance here, perhaps, of explanation or redemption, or of a different kind of wound. Or perhaps it was just the last theater of control left to a man who had kept his peace like a coin under his mattress. "Before we open that," Aunt Marion said smoothly, "let's make sure the record reflects." She barely looked at the lawyer. "That Evelyn walked out of this family years ago. She can claim otherwise, but the pattern is clear." Her voice had the coolness of someone pressing a leaf into a ledger. I remember breathing in, through my chest and down into the hollow where anger lives. I remember thinking, with the ridiculous clarity that comes in traumatic moments, that whether or not I belonged to a family should not be decided by whoever can speak loudest in a lawyer's office. I remember also the way people in the room rearranged their expressions, like curtains being pulled closed on a stage. I kept my hands folded in my lap because my fingers felt like unpolished keys. The rocker of the attorney's chair creaked as she reached for envelopes. She looked up at all of us, at the faces I had known and those I had not. The room watched me like a collection of small mirrors. When she said my name, I felt the heat of eyes on me. Sympathetic, curious, disapproving. This was the moment I had been dreading and, oddly, waiting for. A sealed letter could be a confession, a map, a final anger, a kindness. It could be the torch that either burned the bridge or lit the path across it. I was curling my nails into the palm of my hand when she slit the envelope with a letter opener so precisely it looked like a surgical move. The paper inside smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. The paper was Grandpa's. My heartbeat was a small, wild animal. The attorney removed the folded sheet and cleared her throat. The room held its breath. Aunt Marion rested her hands on her knees, as if to anchor herself. She said, "This letter is addressed to Evelyn Marie Carter," and for a moment I couldn't tell if my name sounded like a beckoning or a verdict. Then she began to read. When the attorney started reading my grandfather's letter, I felt as if the room collapsed inward around the words. Her voice was steady and careful. She read aloud the neat cursive lines I had seen in my grandmother's old diaries. Grandpa had written as though he were speaking to me across a kitchen table. Hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. The first lines were simple. He remembered the day I was born. He wrote that my mother had smiled a smile that didn't finish, and he described to the letter the way he'd watch over me in small, manly ways that made me feel safe when I was a child. Then the tone shifted to something heavier, like a foot stepping over the lip of a well. "I am old," his handwriting began. "There are things I have kept because I thought they would not be believed, or because believing them would have torn us all apart. I love Marion, but I am scared of what she did. You were a child. You did not deserve what was done to you. I did not do enough." It was worse than an apology. It was an admission. The lawyer's voice trembled slightly on the sentence where Grandpa confessed he'd known about certain incidents. Incidents was his word, limp and inadequate, and that he had chosen his daughter over me more than once. He had taken a practical approach, he'd written, because the town trusted Marion, because she was the breadwinner at times and because no one believed a child would lie. He'd been afraid of losing the family he'd built. He'd been afraid of the scandal. He had told himself small lies that bulwarked larger betrayals. He wrote that the cost of silence had been higher than he had imagined. I felt something cold in my throat, A new type of nausea that comes from being unfolded and pressed into a shape that doesn't fit. The letter continued. Grandpa explained that he had left instructions, hidden evidence, boxes in the attic, one rusted tin lunchbox wrapped in wax paper, a tape recorder, and a name of someone he wanted to confront, someone in town they'd thought they could trust. He had left a key and a bank account number, but more importantly he wrote this. Evelyn, I want you to have a choice. Read this, take this, and know that you are my family even if others don't say it. I have been a coward. Use what I left you as you will. The attorney's voice faltered as she reached the lines where he asked me to decide whether to press charges or to put the past away. He insisted that whatever path I chose would be defended by him, by the trust he'd tucked in a safe deposit box in his name. He apologized again for failing me not as an abstract phrase but as a series of events, dusty and specific. It was the most intimate thing he'd ever written. When the room became noisy again, it was the low murmur of people trying to fan themselves from embarrassment. Aunt Marian's face was paper white. I watched her mouth, how it worked, trying to form words. People in my family shifted, seeking anchors in each other's expressions. I tasted the tang of copper and the sharpness of old grief. Grandfather, who had kept stacks of whatever he could, the town's defense against gossip, his own fragile dignity, had left me not just material things but an admission I had longed for and a burden I had not asked to carry. After the letter, Marian stood. Her voice, when it came, was thin and steady. The world had made her an actor of poise. This is preposterous, she declared. This is a dying man's confusion. He had the right to say what he wanted before he died. That does not change the facts. The word felt like a wall. I thought about all the nights I'd had, the ones where my pillow smelled like the detergent we used, where I had replayed The Shape of Wrongness until it hardened. Facts had never been kind to me. They were brittle like old china. I asked myself then, was this going to be another thing to be dismissed, like a rumor that never stuck no matter how true? Or would Grandpa's slow courage, his messy, belated attempt at integrity, open something? There was a beat of silence, then the attorney cleared her throat and said, Mr. Carter's will also designates a safety deposit key to Ms. Evelyn Carter, with instructions that she may access its contents at her discretion. No further legal constraints were placed on the use of the materials he has left. That sentence landed like a lifeline. It meant the evidence, if evidence there was, would be in my hands. It meant the control of memory and accusation was shifting to me. The room shifted. Some faces betrayed satisfaction, others apprehension. Somebody muttered, "This is a circus," and a few people chuckled like a blown fuse trying to select the right emotion. After the reading, people dispersed into small cliques, nestling in the corners of the law office like birds. Aunt Marian moved through the room with that practiced glide of someone who has conducted public sorrow many times. She came to me and very quietly said, "You know what this town is like, Evelyn. People don't like lawsuits and they don't like trouble. Think about what you do. Don't make a spectacle." Her thumb grazed my wrist, an old motion she used to calm me as a child, except that now it felt like a trap. The physical sensation of her touch took me back to the kitchen table when I was 10, when her foot would rest against mine, a signal to be quiet. I pulled my hand away because my body knew better than my mind did what that touch meant. "You think I want a spectacle," I said. My voice sounded small and flat to my own ears. "Think," she repeated softly, as if the word were a compass pointing only in one direction. When I left the building, the sky had gone to a bruised purple. There was the metallic tang in the air that comes before rain. My phone buzzed with messages. Friends, some relatives offering half-hearted condolences, a neighbor from down the road sharing a casserole recipe, and one text from someone I hadn't expected. My cousin Aaron. He asked to meet at the diner at 7. I sat in my car with the engine off, looking at my hands like they belonged to someone I didn't know. Inside, Grandpa's confession and the key it promised shimmered with possibility and peril. There was a part of me that wanted to burn everything and walk out of this town, to keep the pieces of me that were still whole and go someplace I could swallow clean air. But there was another part, a quieter, trembling part, that wanted to listen to the rest of Grandpa's instructions. He had left me the power to decide how our family story would turn. I felt the weight of that power like a scale pressing into my chest. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I found myself thinking because old habits of storytelling have trained me to leave breadcrumbs. This was, in all honesty, a beginning, and I had no idea yet which way it would bend. The rain began to fall in thin, steady threads that traced the windshield. I wiped the glass with the heel of my hand and started the car, the sound of the wipers mimicking the rhythm of my pulse. At the diner, Aaron greeted me with a hug so tight I could feel his ribs. He had been the one cousin who never chose sides outright, or perhaps he had been too afraid to. He slid a plate of fries toward me like an offering. "You okay?" he asked. His eyes were bloodshot, like he'd been crying or staying up. "I heard about the letter. I read it in a room full of people," I said, and the words tasted sovereign and awkward. I told him about the tape recorder, the lunchbox, the safe deposit box. He listened, chin in hand, like someone peering into a deep well. "If Marian's been careful," he said, "she'll have enough help. There are people who will believe her over you just because she's been loud and polished for so long. People always prefer polished lies." "Nice packaging," I replied. My voice broke on the last word. In the diner, coffee steamed and the jukebox played an old song that seemed to belong to my grandparents' era. I felt oddly alive and exhausted all at once, like the moment before a decision that might set the whole room fire, or might simply be the truth finally spoken aloud. I drove home that night with Grandpa's words inside me like a map. The safe deposit key had a number etched into its brass. The address of the bank was on a strip of paper. The letter promised recordings, letters, and proof. It also promised choices. I lay awake the whole night, listening to the building settle, pipes pinging, the air conditioner's rumble, the soft, faraway sound of someone on the other side of town putting a kettle on. Beans of memory rose and sank inside me like a tide. There was fear, the kind that sits in the base of your skull and travels down your spine, but there was also a strange, fierce relief. Grandpa had spoken. He had admitted his cowardice. He had offered me a way forward. I could feel my hands trembling again as I finally drifted off, holding a makeshift plan like a secret talisman. Whatever came next would not be simply about money or papers. It would be about the truth finally being set in motion. The bank smelled of polished wood and lemon-scented cleaner. The teller had a sharp haircut and a polite smile that hid nothing. When I pushed the brass key and the folded piece of paper across the counter, an old man with glassy eyes glanced up from his solitaire and gave a small nod. The safety deposit box room was cool, artificially so, and the metal box clicked with a sound like a small animal being released. Inside, on a bed of tissue paper, sat a rusted metal lunchbox, a cassette recorder with a brittle spool, and a stack of handwritten letters tied with a faded ribbon. There was also an envelope with a photograph. My mother at 7, hair in huge ribbons, my grandfather behind her with an arm around her shoulders, and tucked in the stack a note in Grandpa's handwriting, "If you need proof, start here." I remember the physical sensation of lifting the cassette from the box. How it felt like removing a lid from a jar of old air. I took it home because there was no way I could listen in that room full of strangers and bank cameras. My apartment had the same hum as always. The laundromat downstairs, the neighbor's TV like a distant tide. Yet the objects in my bag felt heavier somehow, as if the contents themselves had mass equal to the years they carried. I made tea, put the recorder on the table, and set the cassette in place. The tape whirred like a small insect finding life. Grandpa's voice came out of the tiny speaker, older, raspy around the corners but unmistakable. "This is Wesley Carter," he said. "If you're hearing this, Evelyn, it means I have died and my cowardice finally followed me into the earth." He paused, and I could hear the paper rustle. "I recorded this because I could not bear to put it into the world while I was alive. I was a man of fear. But I owe you the truth." There followed a sequence of recorded conversations. My grandfather speaking as himself, a younger, shakier voice of my mother, and at one point the recorded murmur of a promise that had been made and broken. There were references to the night at the lake and the handprints on the curtain, Language so specific it threw me against what I'd always called vague bad memories. Each fragment of sound seemed to place a new tile in a map. My childhood recollections, ones I had convinced myself were dreams or misremembered scuffles, formed an outline I could now trace. The lunchbox contained something different. Small paper packets of old receipts with names of doctor visits from years ago, an envelope of photographs, shot from angles that suggested they'd been taken without consent, of a house party where my aunt's expression carried the kind of amorality that hides in plain sight. The letters were the hardest. My mother had written and rewritten a single confession and apology in looping, furious pen strokes. I couldn't keep it together, one line read. And I was always terrified they'd blame you. Another. Wes, we can't live like this. Occasionally there were edges of hope. My mother planning to leave for a new town, to start a life where the old patterns couldn't touch them. The pattern was clear. There had been abuse, small and then escalating, and there'd been attempts to conceal it, to explain it away with reasons that softened the edges. Stress, alcohol, misunderstandings. My hands went cold with each discovery. The physical reaction was not dramatic. It was a small tightening in my chest, like the tightening you get before you sneeze but worse, a pressure that made breath a shallow job. My phone vibrated. Aaron had texted to see how it was going. I answered in a single line. I'm listening. The single word felt like the hinge on a door. Called him over. We sat on the floor of my living room with the coffee table between us and the cassette player spitting out the remainder of Grandpa's archival voice. The more we listened, the clearer it became that these weren't simply family quarrels or the petty cruelties of small towns. There had been real, criminal violations. That rattled something in me that was less like anger and more like a recalibration of the bones. My memories took on new dimensions, like a fog lifting and showing not just the silhouette but the actual shape of the coastline. You need to think about what you want to do, Aaron said, as if he were counseling and not family. He picked at a thread on the carpet and then met my eyes. You could go to the police. You could talk to a lawyer. You could try to handle this quietly. But you need to be prepared. Marion is not going to go quietly. She's got neighbors. She's got influence. People will side with her. I'm prepared for that, I said, and I surprised myself with how small my voice sounded. I was prepared in the sense that I had long been preparing. I'd learned to sleep with one eye open. I'd learned the economy of silence. I'd learned how to turn a memory into a file. But I was also terrified. There is a physical type of terror that feels like the world waiting for a line to finish. You can taste it on your tongue and it makes your legs heavy. We started slow. The legal process couldn't begin without a report, and I didn't know if I could face telling the truth out loud to someone who would then file a report and trigger an entire machine. I booked a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma. The first session felt like leaning into an elevator shaft. You want the safety of the machine, but you're afraid the cables will snap. The therapist listened and validated and recommended we build a support network before going to the police. A list of witnesses, the documentation, perhaps even medical corroboration if I could secure it. That night I dreamed of the house with my grandfather standing in the kitchen. His back to me, the light making him a silhouette. In the dream he turned and said, "You can do something about it," and I woke up clutching the throw pillow as if it were a life preserver. Mornings are the worst for decision-making, or so I have learned. They lay a sheet of light across everything, and you are forced to see your options lit in stark truth. I met with a lawyer, one recommended by a woman at the therapist's office who had been through something similar. The lawyer, an even-voiced woman named Marissa, went through the evidence with a kind of careful attention that makes a person feel both exposed and defended. There is enough here to warrant a conversation with the police, Marissa said. The recordings and the documented medical visits provide a factual timeline. She tapped the photograph stack. But legal action will not be simple. This is a small town. Marion has resources. It will be public. You will be retold in many different voices. So what do? I asked, and this time there was no bravado in it. It was a true question, the kind you ask when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and someone hands you a rope. You decide how much of your life you want to trade for accountability, Marissa said. Her sentence landed like a coin. There is healing in truth, But in our system, truth doesn't always come without cost. I thought for the first time in years about my mother. About the last time she had promised me we would be gone by spring. About the way she had packed and then stood in the doorway and changed her mind. There was a child in me who wanted revenge, who wanted Marion to be called out and reduced to the smallness she had hidden beneath perfumes and smiles. But there was also a woman in me who had learned that justice is rarely neat, and that rage can be a kind of prison. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. The thought of other people, other lives that had been quietly rearranged by the same pattern, comforted me strangely. The internet had always been a place where people carried their scars like talismans and then found one another in the dark. We began to build a plan. Gather the evidence, corroborate it, find neutral witnesses, and prepare emotionally for the blowback. The first step was the hardest, to tell the truth to an officer who would write it down. The evening before I called the non-emergency police line, I sat on the steps outside my apartment and watched steam rise from the laundromat vents. The sky was clear, the stars strangely bright for a city. I thought of Grandpa's letter, of the measurements of his cowardice and his late attempt at courage. I realized then that the story I had lived inside my body for as long as I could remember was not just mine. It belonged to people who had failed me and to a country that sometimes protects those failures with polite euphemisms. In the morning I walked into the station. I left with a copy of a report and a number to call. The universe of small-town social life tightened around me like a net. There were whispers, there were looks. Marion's eyes found mine across the supermarket one day, and something like triumph passed between us, like a ledger being settled. Stung. The first time someone called me brave, it made me feel like a fraud. Bravery implies choice. Sometimes what we call bravery is merely continued survival. But with each small step, each visit to a therapist, each shared document, each small legal meeting, something inside me unlatched. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But a kind of inventorying of what mattered. As the town's rumor mill started to churn, I learned that truth, once released, changes the shape of the people around it. Some recoiled. Some shifted allegiance. Few finally saw me. The town has a coffee shop that doubles as a bulletin board for rumors, and once the police had been involved, that bulletin board filled up like a page being scribbled on. I learned to brace myself for glances that slid off me like rain. Marion moved through town with the same unruffled composure, but the seams of her life had begun to show. Someone dyed their hair a shade too pale. Someone's husband stopped inviting Marion to charity events. But she was also building defenses, statements prepared, a lawyer who smiled too smoothly, references to a bitter ex-friend who holds a grudge. It was a choreography I recognized. My mother had learned it when she left, and it had cost her everything. I met with detectives who listened like they believed in the principle of truth but were wary of the politics in small communities. They asked careful, clinical questions about dates and places and corroboration. The tape recordings and the documented medical visits became part of an evolving file. Aaron sat with me through interviews, holding my hand in the waiting rooms and telling terrible jokes to make us both laugh. In this process, one of the most painful lessons was how many people chose the smoother story. People prefer neat arcs. Perpetrator, confession, punishment. Real life offers mess. The people I expected to stand behind me split across a line that, to this day, catches in my throat. Confrontation came as inevitably as sunrise. Marion's lawyer sent a letter demanding we cease defamatory statements and suggesting arbitration. It was a formal, mean thing. The underlying threat was clear. Go public and you face countersuits. The town's social networks, book clubs, church groups, divided into camps. I received a bloated envelope of anonymous letters containing old photographs and whispered insults. A neighbor who had always brought me leftover pies now crossed the street to avoid me. My therapist explained the stages of trauma response and then paused to say, "This is also about community betrayal," as if I'd somehow expected a different ecosystem. What I had not expected was the smallness of it all sometimes. The way Marion would show up at a charity event, smile a bright public smile, and have people line up to tell her how strong she was. The human need for tidy narratives is astonishing. People cling to them like oxygen. It hurt. It hurt like scraping knuckles on concrete until your nails bleed and you still keep climbing. Yet there were other moments that felt like light finding a cracked door. An old neighbor named Ruth, who had been a friend of my grandmother, took me aside at a funeral and said, I saw what she did, and I was too scared to say, I'm sorry. Another woman, whose brother had similar experiences years ago, sat with me for hours and told me about the long, slow work of feeling your life back into your hands. Those small confessions were like warm stones in my palm. There were times when I wanted to lash out. I wanted to string Marian's name across town like a banner, to take every polite veneer off and watch her scramble. My therapist and my lawyer both warned against revenge as a strategy. It will satisfy for 5 minutes and then you'll have to live with the echo, the therapist said. I understood the counsel, but the wild part of me wanted to tear something down so thoroughly that no one could rebuild it. That impulse, I learned, comes from deep pain. One afternoon, Marian confronted me in the grocery store. She was holding a basket of tomatoes as if they were a decoy. You could have come to me first, she said. We could have handled this in private. You took this to the police like a child with a magnifying glass over an ant. Look what you've done to the family. The world narrowed to the space between us. Customers shuffled past with their carts, pretending grocery shopping was a normal act that could exist outside our collision. I felt the old child inside me reach for a defense, but I also felt Grandpa's letter and the recordings as a kind of backing, like a spine I could lean against. You hurt me, I said finally. The sentence was small, but it felt like a clasp being released. You ruined my life in ways you can't fix. I don't know what you did it for. I'm not asking for you to understand. I'm asking you to be accountable. Her eyes hardened. You're playing with fire. People will turn on you. You think trials fix things. They rarely do. They just make noise. The truth is, she was right in a way. Trials make noise. The legal process swallows lives and spits out verdicts that rarely satisfy the bone-deep loneliness of survivors. Yet, my life had been hollowed in silence for too long. The noise was a way to make space where there had been none. As the legal case moved forward, delicate meetings, depositions, offers of settlement, I watched the family's facade crack. Marian's husband, once a silent force in the background, began to avoid public eye, and her brother, who had always admired her, refused to speak on the phone with me. Our cousin Aaron, who had been my tentative ally, finally admitted that he had known things in the past and had told himself it wasn't his place to act. His confession felt like a smudge of paint revealing layers beneath. Then something unexpected happened. My mother called. I had not spoken to her in nearly 25 years. When she picked up, her voice was like a paper boat, fragile and determined. I saw the paper, she said. Your grandfather wrote the truth, didn't he? I do not remember how I managed to keep my breathing steady. My legs felt like rope. He did, I said. She started to cry then, in a way that sounded like rain on a tin roof. She had been gone so long that the sound of her sadness was at once foreign and familiar. She explained, her words backwards and forwards, that she had left because she thought running was safer, that marriage had been an attempt to survive, that town pressure had made her believe silence was the only way to keep me safe. I thought of all the quarantined years between us, of forbidden hugs and unsent letters. There was a long list of things I wanted to ask her, a longer list of things I wanted to say. What I said was small. I wish you had stayed. I know, she said. I know. Then, after a pause, she said, do you want me to come? It would have been convenient to imagine a cinematic rescue, mother and daughter, reunited inside a courtroom like a pair of avenging angels. Real life doesn't do that neatly. My mother's presence was complicated in ways that would take years to untangle. But having her voice on the other side of the line changed something fundamental. It was a tether. She offered to come to a hearing, to sit in the courtroom, to be a witness perhaps to the pattern that had chased us both across decades. The decision to let someone back into your life after abandonment is a risk measured not in bravado but in calculations of safety and hope. In the courtroom, on a wet Tuesday, we sat separated by rows of oak benches. I watched Marian's face the whole time, like trying to read a map. The prosecutor was careful. The defense was theatrical. Witnesses were called. Documents presented. I felt like I was standing on a ledge. The words spoken felt like stones thrown down to test a river's depth. When my mother took the stand and spoke, she didn't tell everything. Some things you never force from someone. But her testimony, halting and full of those pauses that betrayed truth, supported the rhythm of the narrative we had built with Grandpa's materials. The judge listened like a man who had seen many nights end in a courtroom and many lives rearranged by them. I won't pretend the process ended in a neat closure. Didn't. There were no dramatic prison sentences. No cinematic confessions wrung from pale lips. There were, however, consequences that were quieter but real. A restraining order, community services involvement, a formal note in public records. Marian lost a leadership role she'd held for years. People began to refer to her differently, in the low, careful voice towns use when they've come to terms with an unpleasant truth. Yet the victory did not dissolve the ache I'd carried for decades. Some things aren't fixed by the law. The legal system can do what it can with paper and testimony, but the interior work, therapy, rebuilding trust, reclaiming nights of sleep, was mine. I began to make different choices. I quit a few jobs, moved apartments once more. Invested in therapy that was not a luxury but a necessity. I stopped messaging people who had shown me little loyalty. I started saying no to calls I didn't want. When the town quieted, the hum beneath my ribs still reminded me of what had happened. There were days when the sound was only the ordinary background, coffee steamer, passing cars. And there were nights when the past rode across my chest like a heavy blanket and I could barely breathe. But some days I felt a cautious, startling relief, like sunlight through window blinds. Grandpa's late courage had given me something priceless, a chance to choose how to live the rest of my life, not as a shadow of what had been done to me, but as someone who could name it and take steps forward. The aftermath was slow, as aftermaths always are. When the public proceedings waned, people returned to the rhythms of grocery lists and PTA meetings, but things had shifted. Marian's house, once meticulously kept, grew weeds at the back. The phone lines in our family were partial. Some numbers were disconnected, others remained blocked. People performed normalcy like actors after a hard scene, and sometimes I found that odd. How quickly the world can move on even when your own life has been resorted. I tried to move in that current as best I could, carrying the pieces I'd recovered as carefully as if they were glass. I think the most important part of what happened after all the legal steps and the town's gossip was the quiet inside my own head. The therapist and I worked through layers of abandonment and shame. We unpeeled the lies I'd been told about myself, about being somehow lesser, about being responsible for other people's choices. I learned the vocabulary of boundaries. I learned to recognize the difference between guilt and responsibility. The first is what we feel for our own misdeeds. The second, often heavier, is the acceptance of things we did not cause but that nevertheless shaped our lives. That line, between what you carry because you caused it and what you carry because you survived it, was the most radical lesson. Grandpa's letter remained a touchstone. I kept his folded note in a shoebox with the cassette and the photograph. Sometimes at night I would take it out and read the looping sentence where he admitted cowardice. It did not absolve him entirely, but it opened him, finally, to being human in the way we all are. We make choices to protect ourselves. Sometimes those choices hurt other people. Recognition can be a kind of grace. Guilt without action is merely weight. My mother came back into my orbit slowly. Her presence was awkward and tentative, like a handshake after years of no contact. We didn't bond overnight. There were appointments, shared rides to therapy, awkward dinners with silence filling much of the time, and then, once in a while, a conversation that felt like a doorway opening. It didn't erase the years she wasn't there, but she proved she was willing to show up, to accept me as I am, with my scars and my guarded heart. We did not attempt to build a perfect relationship. We built one that could tolerate imperfection, that felt like courage in its own quiet way. People often ask if I'm healed. The truth is messy. I have better nights now. I can sleep mostly through the night without my body starting into the old vigilant watch I had for a long time. I feel warmer toward myself. But healing, in my experience, isn't a final act. It's a practice like brushing your teeth every morning. Sometimes I still flinch at a sound that echoes something from my childhood. Sometimes I still wake with the taste of old fear. But the frequency of those moments has diminished. They no longer define me. There were lessons in all this that I didn't expect. I learned that silence is not loyalty and that disclosure can be both weapon and shield. I learned that people who say family is everything often mean family is what I want to keep comfortable. I learned to be suspicious of those who wrap themselves in public virtue while hiding private harms. But I also learned compassion for the complicated web that binds people. Fear, self-preservation, love that looks distorted by survival. The most unexpected lesson was an agency. That the smallest decision, to report, to listen to a tape, to say no to a dinner invitation, can be the hinge on which your life turns. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. You never know whose life will shift because someone else found the courage to tell their story. People sometimes want to know whether Marian ever apologized. She did, in a letter that was more about preserving image than about owning harm. It read like a press release. Regret without specificity. I kept it folded, a relic of the person she wanted to be perceived as, not the person she was. Forgiveness is not always necessary. You can grant it if you choose, but you can also keep it from poisoning you with a false sense of closure. In my case, I chose boundaries over absolution. There were other quiet victories. A local community center added programs for adults who had experienced childhood trauma, partly because a few of us spoke up. My therapy scholarship fund, silly as it sounds, was started by a woman who read our local paper and offered to donate, wanting others to have access to the kind of help I received. Small things, small threads that, together, made a patchwork. My life changed in practical ways too. I used some of Grandpa's money to pay for therapy and to relocate into an apartment with a view of the river. I started a small support group online for people from small towns who found themselves triaging their pasts as adults. It wasn't charity as much as community, a place where people could describe their stories without being judged. It became, for me, another kind of family. On the anniversary of Grandpa's death, I stood on the porch of his old house and breathed in the smell of cut grass and distant laundry steam. The house belonged to a new owner now, someone who loved the squeaky porch swing, and I felt oddly relieved about that too. The edges of my life had softened, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that allowed me to look back without falling into it. There is an ending here, but it isn't tidy. The town still talks on some days. People still choose sides sometimes. Families still carry dark rooms. But the final thing I want to leave you with is this. Belonging is not a simple matter of blood or legal papers. Sometimes the people who say you aren't family are the very ones who have failed to protect you when you needed it most. You get to define your family by your choices and your boundaries. You get to call someone family if they show up in the ways that matter. Compassion, honesty, accountability. Grandpa's letter, flawed, late, and human, gave me that permission to redefine. He died imperfectly, but he left me the chance to live differently. If you've stayed this far, thank you. Has something like this ever happened to you? Share below if you feel safe to do so. I read everything, and sometimes your stories are the soft places that make courage grow in others. I still miss the old porch swing. Sometimes I sit on my own balcony and try to make a new rhythm with my life. The ache of what was taken never fully disappears, but it does become a part of the landscape rather than the entire map. Grandpa's last letter taught me a lesson I did not expect. You can admit guilt late, and it can still matter. It is never too late for someone to choose to speak the truth. And it is never too late for you to choose a life that honors your survival rather than your silence.